Morning. Oh, it's good morning. I hope everyone is doing well this morning. Welcome to our C3 Live. And if somebody could please, because I'm still new and getting comfortable with this, could you please, if you navigate away from this screen, the live video will end. No, I want to stay on this page. I'm not quite sure how to see my own video, and I can't see the comments, so I'm trusting that you're all seeing this and that you're in the right place. C3 West Michigan Spiritual Community. So welcome this morning. Welcome to my C3 friends and friends of C3 and those who might be joining us for the first time. I'm Beth Buelow, and I'm a member of C3, and I'm really happy to be a guest teacher this morning while Kent is away enjoying time with his family. Just have to take a deep breath here for a second. There's always that little flurry before the technology. So I'm going to share some thoughts for the next 25-ish minutes or so. And then around 10:30 Eastern time, I'm going to pass over the live stream to our awesome guest musician, Chris DuPont, who's making his debut appearance with C3. And he'll brighten our morning with music from his home base at Ypsilanti, Michigan. After that, please stick around for Talkback, which takes place on Zoom at 11 Eastern. Check your C3 newsletter from Friday for the link. All right. As a values-based community, C3 has stated that we evolve and grow by taking responsibility for our actions in the community and in the world. That's why I am going to share some of my own story this morning and encourage you to dig into yours. We've stated that we value our common humanity, that we respect the dignity and worth of every individual. We value diversity and affirm all people and embrace all genders, sexual orientations, and ethnicities. And we value compassionate action, striving to safeguard and extend human rights, peace, and social justice, locally and globally, as individuals and jointly with others. I have here this morning what I hope is a message that reminds us of the urgency of those values and continues the invitation that Kent has repeatedly extended to us as a C3 community to do a searching moral inventory. Because of the times we're in, I've decided to share some of what I've been sifting through when it comes to my relationship with systemic racism. It's one way I'm trying to take responsibility. It was actually kind of fascinating to search my memory for moments in my life when I was aware of race, but oblivious to the tensions that it caused. By taking this inventory, I've been able to understand more about my prejudices and my privilege. My intention with sharing is that you feel compelled to do your own inventory and then consider and reflect on the conclusions that I offer and how they might apply to you. Spiritual seekers often will create a spiritual autobiography where they compile the narrative of their faith journey and the turning points along the way. Instead of doing a spiritual autobiography, I'm putting together a racial autobiography, and I think every white person should do one. Here are the highlights of mine. I was born in California, and before age 6, I had already lived in California, Spain, and Delaware, because my dad was in the Navy. Just as I was about to start second grade, we moved to Bowling Green, Kentucky, which is in south central Kentucky and about an hour north of Nashville, Tennessee. We were a Catholic family in a Baptist town. And since I went to the parochial school for second and third grade, I was very aware that we were just a bit different from our neighbors. One evening at the dinner table when I was about 7, I offered an analogy about white and black people to my parents that I found, in my 7-year-old mind, rather amusing and clever. 40 years later, I remember exactly what I said. I can almost even put myself back at that dining room table and see and feel what it was like. And I'm not going to repeat those words here. To my parents' credit, they immediately shut me down with just the right amount of shame that I knew immediately that I had said something awful and that I was to never, ever do that again. I never did, and I never have. But I am still haunted by what I said. And I feel sad for 7-year-old Beth, who would never hurt anyone, but still had a twisted thought and said it aloud. I don't remember having many Black classmates in elementary school, but I did have a Black teacher, Mrs. Sisney, in 5th grade. I really liked her. But I do have one bad spelling test memory, probably something we all have. Mrs. Sisney was walking up and down the aisles of the classroom, saying each word on the list to us to spell on our test paper. One of the first words she said was business. I was so confused. I didn't understand what she meant. So on my paper, I misspelled the word business. And of course, I did not get 100% on my test. And I remember at least thinking, and probably saying in anger to my mom, why didn't she pronounce it right, like other people? My favorite shows growing up were some of the most popular of the time. So this was like, I was born in 1971, so 70s and early 80s. And that included The Dukes of Hazzard, known for its Confederate flag painted on the roof of the General Lee. I also watched The Jeffersons, Good Times, and Different Strokes. It was from The Jeffersons that I first heard the word honky and learned about the Ku Klux Klan. When I asked my dad, what's the KKK, he told me that they hated Black people and Catholics. And being Catholic, that terrified me. And I asked, how could someone hate me just because of my religion? It made absolutely no sense. I remember visiting my cousin in West Virginia when I was 10 or 11, and when she tried to claim that Kentucky was a Confederate state, I became belligerent and insisted it wasn't. Because, of course, at that point, I had started to learn a little bit of history, and I associated the Confederacy with bad people, and I didn't want to be associated with bad people. Of course, in the Civil War, Kentucky was neutral, which is what I told my cousin. They had almost 4 times as many Union soldiers as Confederate. Now fast forward to high school and experiencing a more diverse environment, but still very segregated. We mixed a little in choir and a little bit more in band. The last row of the clarinet section was almost all Black girls who seemed to have way more fun than the rest of us. They would often ask me to help them with their music after school, which I gladly did. And that was my first experience in teaching someone something. And I remember that fondly. But now, and this is something that I just came into my awareness a few days ago in thinking about it, I look back with some grief, remembering that we also had a tradition at summer band camp of the seniors getting to choose one of the freshman band members to be their slave for the duration of band camp, fetching them things and doing chores for them. It was funny at the time, but now I look back and I wonder what the Black girls in the back of the clarinet section thought of the whole thing. I hope that sharing all of that doesn't sound self-indulgent. I've just come to realize that if white people are going to be part of the solution of the horrible past and present of racism, we need to acknowledge our experiences and to some degree extend compassion to ourselves so that we don't lead our efforts to be allies out of white guilt. I have to forgive my 7-year-old, 10-year-old, 16-year-old self and understand that those are just a few of the experiences and memories that have shaped my 48-year-old attitudes and understandings about race. And that brings me to a few more recent years in my racial autobiography. Here's an adult memory. I was driving down I-5 between Tacoma and Seattle about 7 years ago, and I heard a story on NPR about a controversy in a southern town where the Black community was seeking reparations and apologies from city leaders and law enforcement for events that had happened in that town more than 100 years ago. Listening to this, I was genuinely confused. The people asking for reparations weren't alive when those events happened. None of those leaders or police had anything to do with what happened 100 years ago. Why should they be asked to take responsibility? I didn't get it then, but I do now. Very soon after hearing that story, the Black Lives Matter movement surfaced in response to the killing of Trayvon Martin, and I was again confused. It took me a while to wrap my head around it. Of course, I knew the killing was wrong. I knew that the acquittal of George Zimmerman was wrong, and I knew that Black lives mattered. I just didn't get why all lives matter was so inappropriate. I didn't get it then, but I do now. Last fall, I attended a Community Gathering Initiative event in Muskegon. The Community Gathering Initiative is a series of community conversations about race, and there's usually around 20 to 30 people who attend, and they're fairly evenly distributed between Black and white participants. At this particular session, we were offering reflections after watching a video, and I decided to make a comment. As I thought about it, I found my mind kind of stuttering, like, what's the right phrase that I should use? Is it Black people, African American, people of color? I was so nervous about offending someone that I ended up saying something worse. I used the phrase non-white people. And even just thinking about it right now, I feel mortified. As soon as the words passed my lips, I knew that they were wrong on every possible level. No one called me out on it, and I almost called myself out, but I didn't. It probably would have been okay to say, and probably would have been the right thing to say. I want to acknowledge that that was a very poor choice of words, and I apologize. Not offering any excuses, and certainly not overdoing it so that it looked like I was trying to seek validation that, oh, it's okay, you're all right, you're a good person. But I had shocked myself too much to do anything in the moment, so I stayed quiet. It's hard to go on the record about this. I'm on Facebook Live. This video will live on. Certainly saying these things aloud to you doesn't mean that my work is done. Far from it. It's more of a starting point. By reflecting on my role and on our role in systemic racism, we also have to include the even more challenging task of reflecting on our white privilege, the times where we were both aware and unaware that our white skin offered us opportunities, both to advance and to avoid punishment. And it might be challenging as you're doing this to think of very specific instances, and I would invite you to say that's part of the challenge, because it is, the privilege is that it's a huge blind spot for us. So you can probably make some assumptions in your own story. If you got off with a warning instead of a ticket, or a ticket without being detained, if you got a scholarship, if you received, excellent medical care when everything else was, maybe chaotic in the ER. If you had somebody who was willing to stay with you after school to help tutor you when you were struggling. All of those things are potentially examples of where your white privilege was coming into play. And it doesn't take a Black person being around a Black or brown person to make that true. It just happens, and that's part of what we have to acknowledge. Every single one of us finds ourselves at a turning point right now on this very long journey, and it's important to know what baggage we're dragging along behind us. If we don't unpack that baggage and look at it, we'll never be able to lighten the load enough to do the hard work that needs to be done to heal. So what is this turning point? And is it really that? And I want to take a moment just to zoom out to give us some historical context. Because June is a really interesting month. And even today, June 14th is an interesting day. June 14th is Flag Day, marking the day in 1777 when the Second Continental Congress passed a resolution adopting the Stars and Stripes as our nation's flag. June 14th, 1954, is when the words "under God" were added to the Pledge of Allegiance. As I reflect on that, it strikes me that our priorities then and now are still misplaced. We should have been putting more emphasis on the words liberty and justice for all. June 14th, 1946 is when Donald John Trump was born. It brings up in my mind the butterfly effect from chaos theory, which says that when a butterfly flutters its wings over here, it's only a matter of time before a tornado roars across the landscape on the other side of the world. Trump's birth was a butterfly flutter. And I have to admit, I never thought I'd say the words Trump and butterfly in the same sentence, but there you go. It was a butterfly flutter that set in motion the tornado that we're currently living in. And it's tempting to wish that we had a time machine and that we could go back and somehow stop the conception of Trump. And yes, there are memes about that. It's easy to think the world would be better off. But without that flutter, we might not be standing right now at the precipice of monumental and desperately needed change in the way our society relates to race, gender, equity, and democracy. The precipice isn't pretty, and it's certainly not easy, but it was never going to be. And I can only imagine that the longer it takes to happen, the uglier it's going to get. June also gives us Juneteenth, which celebrates the events of June 19, 1865, when slaves in Galveston, Texas were officially emancipated, more than 2 years after Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. What we're experiencing now, at least in my mind, and I'm sure in many others, is begging the question, is the process of emancipation still happening? We can't say, Emancipation Proclamation, check, that's done. When brown and black people still feel oppressed and enslaved by the reality of systemic racism, can we just own the fact that emancipation isn't finished, that it's a work in progress? I'm pretty sure that black people, if they heard that, they would say, yeah, it's about time you figured that out. If we see it as a work in progress, we can better appreciate that more than 100 years after Juneteenth, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 were all seen as part of the ongoing manifestation of the Emancipation Proclamation. There was another June milestone that helped with the true emancipation and helping it become more of a reality. On June 12th, which was just this Friday, it was Loving Day, which is a celebration marking the day in 1967 when the Supreme Court struck down state bans on interracial marriage. Now, 155 years after Juneteenth, is the call to defund the police, enact criminal justice reform, and realize that Black lives matter. And I wonder, and I hope, that these are all the next steps in making the Emancipation Proclamation a true reality. I have hope based on another June event, this time June 28th, 1969. That night in New York City, the Stonewall Riots proved to be a catalyst for LGBTQ people to say enough. The Stonewall Inn was a popular gay bar at a time when people were being arrested and killed for who they loved. The police showed up and they raided the bar. In the midst of the chaos, a woman shouted out to those around her, "Why don't you guys do something?" And then people stepped up to fight back. The riot started, and with it, over time, so did the shift in attitudes towards the rights of gays and lesbians. I learned about this turning point not in school, but while listening to an episode of Hidden Brain last spring. The episode focuses on the remarkable change in public opinion about gay rights over a 30-year time frame. In 1988, when the General Social Survey first asked the question about same-sex marriage, only 11.6% of respondents, 11.6%, said that same-sex couples should have the right to marry. Again, 1988, 11.6%. In that same survey, 30 years later, that number rose to an astounding 68%. Experts interviewed on this podcast described this 30-year time span as being so fast relative to other social change that it was almost like someone had flipped a switch. So the researchers decided to do a thought experiment. They extended the trend lines of the data to see how long it would take for bias to be entirely eliminated. They weren't trying to predict the future, but rather get a sense of the speed at which different biases were changing. One of the researchers stated that the forecasts show that if things go swimmingly well, in 9 years, that would be, I should have done the math, but I think that's like 2027, anti-gay attitudes will be all but eliminated, that we will reach neutrality. They go on to estimate that when we're talking about race issues, they project it will take nearly 6 decades for Americans to see black and whites the same way. But even that progress doesn't mean the end of the challenges. Biases about skin tone, preferences for lighter skin over darker skin, that would take 138 more years if the current trends persist. Here's another bit of insight from that same episode. Hidden Brain host Shankar Vedantam said, many historians locate the start of the modern gay rights movement to the Stonewall Riots. Of course, history doesn't come with a start date. You can go back further and you'll find examples of activism. But Stonewall was a pivotal moment. Gay people were saying, enough, stop harassing us. But the protest did something else. Sociologist Michael Rosenfeld says that for the first time in the lives of many Americans, gay people were making themselves visible. Now, you can easily take that commentary from 2019, a year ago, and update it for today. The murder of George Floyd was a pivotal moment. Black people are saying, enough, stop harassing us, stop killing us. For the first time in the lives of many Americans, Black people are making themselves and their reality visible. Black lives have been waiting since 1619, 401 years, for our attitudes to shift, to be seen and treated and respected as equals. So, can we survive as a nation if, as the researchers project, it takes another 60 years for racial divisions to dissolve? And that brings me with what I want to leave you with today. First, we've all heard that phrase, patience is a virtue. I'm pretty sure we've even talked about it at C3. And if you Google quotes about patience, you'll have no shortage of sayings that basically make patience next to godliness. This one from Francis Bacon in particular stood out to me. Whoever is out of patience is out of possession of their soul. Black and brown people have run out of patience, yet I see no sign that they've lost possession of their souls. They are like the woman at the Stonewall Inn, pleading with anyone who will listen. Why don't you guys do something? I've heard from many Black friends and colleagues over the past few weeks. They're tired. They're exhausted. They're sick of being patient and of having to deal with systems of oppression every single day. They're done doing the right thing, which means the white thing, and they're still not getting ahead. They're working twice as hard to get half as much. They're tired of being scared for their sons and husbands, fathers and friends. It seems like, finally, white people are out of patience. And I'm speaking for myself too. I have been inappropriately patient. The coronavirus that has disproportionately infected and killed people of color has highlighted the reality of many of them as essential workers on the front lines, living on that razor's edge of being one missing paycheck away from eviction or not being able to provide for their families. They didn't have the privilege of staying home, so their exposure was far greater. And now with the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, too many others, what we know intellectually, that Black people are questioned, detained, arrested, harassed, killed by police far more than white people, that intellectual knowing has become shockingly emotional. And it's not that we didn't know that this was happening, but it took a perfect storm of a deadly virus, a racist president, and a brutal murder caught on video to make us finally hear that 400-year-old plea. Why don't you guys do something? So here's my first point. Right now, patience isn't a virtue. It's a privilege. Patience is a privilege. It's easy to say, be patient, we'll get there, when you're coming from white privilege, because the water we swim in is warm and gentle, and we can just float when we get tired. But people of color are swimming in shark-infested waters, full of riptides that can pull them under at any second. The time for patience as our default is over. I'm not suggesting that we become violent or that we start using rioting and violence to incite change, but we do need more and consistent peaceful protests, more direct and forceful ways of letting our leaders know that we are done. When we talk of systemic racism, we can't direct all of our people all of our anger at the police alone. Systemic means it's a system. And that system includes education, healthcare, access to jobs and capital and credit, transportation and food security, in addition to the criminal justice system. We must be courageous enough to take a critical and unflinching inventory of our systems and our institutions so that we can eliminate racism for good. We can't let ourselves get distracted by outrageous tweets or the latest political villain. We have to see the big picture and take the long view, but we can also be impatient when it comes to making meaningful, decisive action right now. We have to decide that impatience is a virtue. A virtue is a moral choice, and right now, the moral and ethical thing to do is to stand up to discrimination and injustice with every ounce of energy we have. We're being called to channel impatience in a healthy way that keeps a sense of urgency alive, that keeps hope alive, and ultimately keeps Black and brown people alive. Among the very few quotes that I found about the positive side of impatience was from George Jackson, an African-American author and activist who was killed during an attempted escape from Soledad prison in 1971, maybe about 3 weeks before I was born. He wrote, "Patience has its limits. Take it too far, and it's cowardice. Patience has its limits. Taken too far, and it's cowardice." If our patience is a privilege, we can hide in it for too long. And when we do that, we're not only cowardly, we're complicit. Now the question is, if we decide that impatience is our only option, how do we use it for good and not evil? I wanted to share a story with you about an encounter I had at Domino's, and I'll have to share it during the talk back because it was a meaningful moment for me that just happened a week ago. And it demonstrates the example of the balance between patience and impatience, because it was one of those moments when a few years ago it would have infuriated me, but I don't know that I would have taken action. But now my sense of urgency and of impatience has been activated. And as I've seen on signs at protest, silence equals violence. Being patient in the face of systemic, constant injustice just isn't an option anymore. We can't wait to see if our elected officials get with the program. We have to be vocal and visible with our impatience. We have to keep showing up and saying, why don't you guys do something? That brings me to my final point. White people are getting snapped out of complacency and no longer want to be complicit in racism. They want to do something. I hear over and over, and I ask myself, what's the something I can do? I see lists circulating on social media, everything from 5 things that you can do to 100 things you can do to end racism. It was actually a relief to see a tweet from Denzel Washington, and I don't know if this is his quote. It wasn't attributed to anyone, and I've seen it in different places, but it says, "Resistance is not a one-lane highway. Maybe your lane is protesting. Maybe your lane is organizing. Maybe your lane is counseling. Maybe your lane is art activism. Maybe your lane is surviving the day. Do not feel guilty for not occupying every lane. We need all of them." His words encourage us to pick a lane and to know that small things make a difference. If your lane is putting a sign in your yard, do it. If it's donating to the ACLU, a social service agency, political campaigns, or supporting Black-owned businesses, do it. If it's volunteering, do it. If it's starting a community garden, do it. If it's attending city councils, do it. If it's reading Black authors, Black history, and books about white fragility, do it. If it's the joining with others for the next 2 Sundays at noon in Central Park at Grand Haven for the Vigil for Peace and Justice, do it. You don't have to do all of those things. Start with one. Start locally, because that's the key that unlocks wider systemic change. Start with one lane, because that one small action or choice will lead to the next one, and the one after that. And if we all pick a lane and we commit to it, we can make sure that we haven't wasted the energy of this moment. And if you believe that the time for patience is past, feel free to pick a fast lane. I'll close by sharing that I read an op-ed this morning in the Washington Post titled, "When Black People Are in Pain, White People Just Join Book Clubs." And it was written by Trey Johnson. And honestly, at first reading, it struck me as completely cynical. And I admit, it kind of activated my white fragility and defensiveness just a little bit. But I was able to let that go pretty quickly, remembering the message that I was going to be sharing with you, that Black people are done with white platitudes and one-off book groups and trendy outrage. They're watching us impatiently to see if we walk our talk. Whatever lane you choose, and yes, a book group is a legitimate lane, the point is that you have to make it meaningful and powerful and see it as a lane that goes on for miles, and own your responsibility to the people who are depending on you to be in this for the long haul. Remember the values I mentioned at the beginning: responsibility, common humanity, diversity, compassionate action. It's easy to pay lip service to those values, and it can be risky and difficult to really live those values, to take action, to stretch into the uncomfortable places they often take you. We are going to step in it. We are going to mess up, and we're going to get tired. We have to keep going. We have to keep listening. If we see something, we have to say something. Change will only come when people are willing to mess up, to be uncomfortable, and to fall down 7 times and get up 8. So thank you so much. My time is up, and I'm just pulling up some announcements I have real quick as I pass the baton. Please stay with us for the next 20 minutes or so and enjoy guest musician Chris DuPont. We'll have talk back at 11, and the Zoom link for that is in the C3 newsletter. If you don't get the newsletter, and by the way, you should, because it's the best way to find out what's happening in the C3 community. If you need that talk back Zoom link, please send me a private Facebook message and I'll pass it along. Thank you for listening. Be well and keep showing up.